The next pit stop on our tour, we're going to hear from James Thomson, who is company's editor at the Australian Financial Review. I met James many years ago, around 2007-8, when he was working at Smart Company as their editor. And so he brings some really amazing, insightful information about the markets. And James has very kindly agreed to speak with us again. This is his fourth year at our fourth breakfast, so we're very grateful for that, James. Thank you very much. His job this morning is to actually bring us the latest news and insights about the markets and what we need to take into account when making strategic business decisions, and hopefully that will help us go from the ordinary to the extraordinary. So please welcome James Thomson.
Congratulations to you and the Barrett team. I think this breakfast seems to get bigger and bigger each year, and to get this many people out of bed and looking so sharp at this early in the morning is quite a credit to you. So congratulations to Sue. If you're at the event last year, you might remember my presentation was about sort of reasons to be cheerful about the Australian economy. I'm happy to say that a lot of those factors do remain in place, but there are some dark clouds on the horizon that we need to keep an eye out for. So what I've decided to do is today is to present 18 big numbers about the local and global economy, 10 of which are sort of in the glass half full category and 8 of which are in the glass half empty category. But let's kick off with some happy numbers. 102 quarters without a recession. I know I've got a few fantastic athletes in the room, and if you're feeling a little inferior to them, this is one world record that we will soon be able to claim ourselves as a collective economy. 102 quarters without a recession, that's 25 and a half years. We're in our 26th year of unbroken economic growth. And we look almost certain to surpass the world record holder for consecutive quarters of economic growth. Does anyone want to have a stab at who that might be? It's early, I'll let you off. It's the Netherlands. So if any of our athletes are up against a Dutch opponent the next time they're out there and they need a little extra bit of trash talk, they can say, we're going to get your record of 100. We'll soon have 104 quarters of unbroken economic growth. It looks almost certain we'll get there. We had a tough quarter in the December quarter last year, but in the September quarter, but we bounced back 1.1% growth in the December quarter, so we're on track for our record. 2.7%, speaking of economic growth, is the rate we've had between 2011 and 2016. Now that does sound a little anemic. The RBA likes to think that trend growth is 3%, so the economy grows by 3% every year. We're a little bit under that, but by the same token, this is a very impressive number internationally. The list of countries that we've beaten for economic growth during that period: the USA, Britain, Japan, Brazil, Russia, and every country in Europe. The entire Eurozone has been growing slower than that. So Australia is not going too badly on sort of an economic international basis. 69 months since global manufacturing was travelling this well. A few weeks ago we had a big financial review business summit up in Sydney, and one of the speakers we got out from Britain was a guy called Jim O'Neill, who's a global economist. His claim to fame is he invented the BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India and China. He was the guy who came up with that moniker to describe the sort of powerhouse economies that would carry the world forward over the next 50 years. There are 6 factors that Jim has learnt to watch as sort of leading indicators of the global economy. And one of the most important is global manufacturing. Every month around the world there's a variety of surveys of purchasing managers in the manufacturing sector, and they collate this into a purchasing managers index, the PMI. And at the moment it's going as well as it has been for a long time. So this is the JP Morgan Global PMI sort of collated together. And at the end there, circled, you can see the result for February. But you can also see that January was an extremely strong month. And the trend over the last, well, really the last year is very positive. So while we do feel that Australia's economic growth is perhaps a little bit behind where it is, and the world's had a tough period since the GFC, you can start to see that the global economy is kicking back and has started the year very well. Another factor to do with that is from South Korea. 20.2% increase in South Korean exports. Now, you're probably wondering, why do I care about South Korean exports? And you don't, but what is interesting about the South Koreans is that they collate their data extraordinarily quickly. So this is the figure for March, and it was out on March 1. So, sorry, this is the figure for February, and the data was released on March 1. So there's a tiny lag, a lag of a day before you get a feel for what South Korean exports are doing. Now, South Korea is a crucial sort of shipping hub, so getting an idea of all the tech goods and the gadgets and all the sort of products that are going out of South Korea gives you a feel for how the global economy is going. And it's going pretty well. 20.2% jump in February. There was an 11.2% rise in exports in January. And this is way ahead of where most economists expected the South Korean export market would be. Now, just to sort of recap on Jim O'Neill's argument, I guess, his argument is that the global economy is going better than we think. And his sort of follow-up argument to that is that that's a good sign for global politics. So obviously, we've seen in the last year or so the rise of populism around the world, which has led to the Brexit vote and, of course, the election of Donald Trump. A lot of that has been driven by concerns about the global economy and particularly global trade, and that's why you're seeing people talk about throwing up tariff walls and starting to put in trade protections. Jim's argument is that that has happened because there was a period of slack global economic growth, but that appears to be behind us. So his sort of argument is that that period of populism may well be short-lived as the global economy sort of gets back on its feet and starts to rev up again. So the likes of the sort of Trump, Brexit, populist movements, there's a lot of them in Europe at the moment, might be a relatively short-lived thing, which would probably be a good thing for the global economy. 1.5%, Australia's historically low interest rate. Not much to say here, other than the fact it's worth pointing out again and again that debt is extraordinarily cheap in this country and really around the world. The problem a little bit is that companies don't seem to be keen to borrow to do anything with that debt, but the settings are right. There's a lot of conjecture about where the next rate movement will be. There's a school of thought that there might be a movement up at the end of this year as economies like the US and Britain start to increase their rates. And there's another school of thought that says we may well need another cut for some of the reasons that I'll get to. I think probably the middle course is the right one. There's unlikely to be a move this year, and there may well not be a move well into 2018. So your mortgage rate, except for what the banks do, should stay pretty steady. Looking at where companies are, so 59% of companies grew profits in the first half. There's 2 reporting seasons every year, you probably know, where companies explain their results for the previous 6 months. We had one in February. 59% of companies grew their profits year on year, which is not a bad sign. 80% of companies increased their dividends, and the average profit growth during the February season was 4%. So that means looking ahead to the full financial year, the full 2016-17 period, we're expecting profit growth of 19%. But there is a bit of a caveat on that, and that's that a lot of that has to do with the resources sector bouncing back particularly hard. Commodity prices were terrible at the start of last year. They grew during most of 2016, and they're still holding up really well. In fact, a bonus number for you is $86. Which is the average price of a tonne of iron ore since the start of this year. Again, you're thinking, I don't sell to the mining industry, I'm not interested in mining, why do I care about the iron ore price? Fair enough, but a higher iron ore price is good for the rest of the economy. Higher iron ore prices mean the miners make bigger profits. Miners making bigger profits means miners pay more tax. More tax means that the government's got more money to play with, and as the Federal Treasurer Scott Morrison prepares for his federal budget in May, that should mean that he doesn't have to cut so hard on spending. which is a good thing. The bigger the spending cuts are, the more sort of damage that can do to the economy. So higher iron ore prices should help the wider economy as well. Just back to the market. So you take out the effect of that resources rebound, and what we're looking at is an anticipated growth rate in profits of 4% for the financial year 2017. So it's not great, but it's not terrible either. And I think the mood from the reporting season we've just had was one of sort of cautious optimism. There's still a lot of cost containment going on, but equally companies are starting to realise that they do need to lift their eyes and start looking at growth options. A 9% rise in the ASX 200 since Donald Trump was elected. We actually hit a 2-year high on the ASX yesterday. I mean, I guess while the Trump era, which is sort of 67 days old or something like that, it's been a freak show, really. But it has been pretty good for investors around the world. And they're essentially betting that Trump's pro-business policy platform is going to be good for company profits. Now, sure, the corporate tax cuts that he's planning to bring in are largely unaffordable for America, and the tariff walls that he's promising and the physical walls in Mexico are not great for global trade. And this whole stripping back of regulation, which he's promising, will undoubtedly be bad for the environment. But the markets are selfish beasts, and they see the dollar signs and react accordingly. So the global markets are up around the world. We've seen a series of record highs on Wall Street as well. There is a little bit of a nervousness about this. Obviously, last week we saw Trump fail to get through the healthcare bill, which was a big part of his the platform that got him elected, and that has the markets jittery that he won't be able to deliver on other things like the tax cut and like reform and infrastructure programs and that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see whether the Trump bump starts to fade over the next few months, weeks, and probably years as we get a sense of whether he can actually force some of this legislative change through. It's the jury is definitely out. So that's the sort of good news picture, and now for some slightly more worrying numbers. This doesn't look like a worrying number. 47% is the increase in Melbourne home values in the past 5 years, and you're probably saying, that's great news. I own a house and the price has shot up and I'm feeling a lot richer, which is fair enough. That's good, but it's not necessarily the fact that property prices are growing. It's the size and speed of the growth rate that is a concern. It's even worse in Sydney. Sydney house prices are up 71% in the last 5 years. Oh my God. So why is this bad? For a few reasons. The first being that my 3 children, and probably their children, will be living with me until they're 52. The second is that we are spending way too much on our mortgage payments. About 7% of average household income goes on the mortgage. And that's actually higher than back in 1989 when some of you remember mortgage rates were running at 16%, not the 5.5% that they are now. So to be paying more on our mortgages under these low interest rate conditions is quite extraordinary. The third reason is that the rise in house prices now means that Australians are pretty deeply in debt. The ratio of household debt to GDP is 123%. And that's the third highest rate in the world, behind the home of the Swiss Army knife, Switzerland, and the home of Lego, Denmark. They're the only 2 countries ahead of us. And it's a debt load that leaves us vulnerable. As you would know from your own businesses and perhaps your own personal situations at various times in your life, debt takes away your options. It makes it hard when things turn tight. Now, there's two things that could really hit the Australian economy given our debt load. That's a sudden economic crash. That doesn't feel very likely given the trend in global growth. And the others are a quick rise in interest rates. Again, that doesn't feel likely. But there are some signs that we're stressed, I guess, in the economy. And the biggest one, I think, is this. 14%, which is the combined unemployment rate with the combined underemployment rate. So that's we've got an unemployment rate of 5.8%, and then if you add the rate, the rate encompassing people who would like to work more than they are now, you get to a rate of 14%. It's not great, particularly when you consider the US has a combined and unemployment rate of 9.4%, so we're well ahead of them. And again, it just speaks to the sort of vulnerability of the economy, where we've got very high debt on one side, and then on the other side, we've got a situation where we're perhaps not earning as much as we'd like. Just quickly as an aside, 6.1% is the unemployment rate in Victoria. So that's a few percentage points, sorry, higher than the national average. We've obviously had a lot of manufacturing close down over the last 5 years, and we're still seeing some pretty large-scale job losses. Hazelwood power stations closing down at the moment. So that'll leave some high unemployment numbers, particularly in regional areas. So it's just one to watch. Victoria is lagging the national average a little bit. 1.9% is the rise in average wages in the 12 months to December. If there's one figure that you should be most worried about, it is definitely this one. For the last 6 months, wages in Australia have been growing at the slowest rate on record that's ever in our history. And if you take out inflation from that 1.9% figure, the wages are growing at about 0.4%, which basically means they're not growing at all. This is a really worrying state of affairs. Stagnant wages means obviously people have less money to spend on everything from food and education and health and gifts and all that sort of stuff. Everything it seems except housing, where we still manage to find plenty of more money. But of course, low spending from the consumer means low revenue growth and low profit growth for companies, which of course, and the companies react of course by cutting costs. What's their biggest cost? It's labour. And then you get back to this sort of vicious circle of wages not rising. These are the sort of conditions where economies get stuck in a low gear, where inequality starts to rise more than it is now, and then you sort of have this rich get richer, poor get poorer feel. And of course, that's the fertile ground where politicians who can come in and promise to solve everything start to get a really good hearing, as we saw with Trump and the Brexit movement in the UK. So this is the big concern, and this is why the economy needs to start motoring along a bit more. And directly linked to that is a 15.5% fall in company expenditure in the 12 months to December. Look, this isn't actually too bad a result because the mining sector is slowing down its investment, is slowing down very quickly, which sounds stupid, but it's pulling back from investment very quickly. The mining sector's investment is 30% below where they expected it to be this time last year. And there is a little bit of hope that non-mining investment will start to pick up through the back half of this year, and certainly government spending is starting to pick up. We're seeing a lot more infrastructure projects, which is good for the economy. But what we're probably looking at is that business investment stays flat across a year rather than grows. So again, one to watch, and it does relate back to that wages issue. I mentioned before that if we were to have a sudden economic crash, it's probably going to come from one place, and that's China, where 40 to 50% of Chinese debt, of new Chinese debt, is being taken out to repay old Chinese debt. The debt figures in China are pretty staggering. Obviously, they've had a rapid economic expansion, and that's come with a pretty big pile of IOUs. Back in 2007, the total debt to GDP ratio was 147%. 2016 is now 279%. Of course, the Chinese government is very different to ours. They don't have a Senate or they just do what they want, and they do it when they want it. So they will be able to manage this economy much more closely and much faster than we would be able to in Australia. But there are concerns, like we've seen in recent weeks. The Chinese government have their big sort of National People's Congress, and they have expressed concerns about the level of debt and the potential for the debt bubble to explode. And it would be chaos. It would really hit Australia's economy very hard. That's where all our minerals exports are going. It's where a lot of our education exports and increasingly services and food exports are going there. And of course, it would probably shake the sort of social order in China as well if there was a really disastrous explosion of this debt bubble. So that would be something to watch. It's not something that feels really, really likely, but it's one to keep in the back of your mind as probably the most vulnerable point of the Australian economy. And my final number is 11. 11 crossbenchers in the Senate. I'll make no comment on the politics or personas of the likes of Malcolm Roberts, Pauline Hanson and Jackie Lambie, but if you want to know why things are getting gridlocked and why reform on a lot of these issues, important reform does seem close to impossible at the moment, it is because we have this structure of a large crossbench that the government needs to deal with to get any legislation through, and we're seeing it at the moment. Not much legislation or not much reforms getting through at all. So we do have some issues that we need to fix, and for me the wages growth issues. One, housing affordability and making sure that the housing bubble doesn't create a big problem for us is probably the other one. So those sort of problems need proper reform, and proper reform at the moment is really hard to deal with. So that's one, and another one to watch. And with that, I think my number's up, and I'll hand over back to Sue.